tell you about human beings. And even to this day, and if I have any psych profs in the group here, they can shoot me later. If somebody says to me, how do you learn about people? I say, go to the movies, go to the theater, read literature. I don't know if you want to take a psych course. I don't know if you learn anything about people in psychology. And the problem, I guess, I see is that at least in the years I was very intensely involved in psychology as such, we were so busy proving we were science, we never talked about people. And I've had a PhD now for 18 years, and what I find is each year I become less of a scientist and more of a human being, and I'm kind of pleased with that because I can suddenly talk to people, and it's sort of fun again. So I think there's something good about science in that it's a public way of understanding phenomenon, but I think if we worship science as science and precision for the sake of precision, we're really missing the boat. Well, the second trend in psychology, you could really think of these as threads or trends or points of orientation. Watson was saying be objective and be scientific. Freud was saying be subjective and understand what's going on inside people's heads. And so he was taking just the opposite stance from Watson, and his feeling was the way we scientifically understand people is to get them to reveal to us what's going on inside their heads. And so here's a very different strategy, be subjective as against be objective. The third thread in psychology is personified by Gordon Allport, and Allport's stance was a humanistic orientation, which says instead of thinking of man as stimulus-response connections or as victims of our early childhood, he said human beings grow, they develop, they think, they reason, and the name of the game is to ever become. And for those of you who read such books, you may be familiar with Gordon Allport's Becoming. In it, he says man as a cognitive being is constantly engaged in a creative process. Well, I'd like to believe that these three threads in psychology, from the objective scientific concern, the subjective personal concern, and this action orientation, people grow, let's do something about it. From these three roots came environmental psychology. And if you look at the literature in this field, or at least the early literature, it's very puzzling to most students who aren't on the inside, because if you take a book like Ed Hall is an anthropologist. The kinds of experiences he has, the kinds of data he collects, has to do with participant observation. He looks around subcultures and cultures, he visits them, and he draws conclusions based on these rather casual experiences. And usually the scale of his conclusion has to do with differences from culture to culture. In contrast, Bob Summers' personal space is a social psychological approach. He does interviews or surveys, or he systematically observes, he comes up with numbers, he has statistical tables. And what he's saying is, I want to understand how groups and individuals behave in space. So his data is different, the words he uses is different, the scale of his concern is different, and the applications that might be made from his information is different. So if you read Bob Sommer and Ed Hall, you didn't realize one's an anthropologist and one's a psychologist, you might not comprehend how come they're coming up with that kind of stuff. The third book, Kinesics and Context, is written by a fellow named Birdwhistle, and his claim to fame is looking at behavior very close up. He uses movies and he analyzes behavior in a very explicit manner, more like a human factors approach, where he's saying, how do people posture themselves? Do they face towards each other? Do they sit? Do they stand? So what we've really got is three scales of information. We've got a very nitty-gritty scale in Birdwhistle's work, a broader scale in Somers, and then the broadest scale in a cultural sense in Hall's. Well, again, if you don't know where these people came from and you start reading their works, they really don't seem to be connected, and yet they're connected in very real ways, because all of these levels are of relevance to designers who are working at different scales themselves, and some of the material they bring would be relevant at every scale of design. Well, as I say, we inherited this label, environmental analysis, and it took me 2 years to figure out what it was, and this is what it is. And all we're talking about is really applied social science. I'm saying that this field of endeavor is systematic, which means it's orderly. It's empirical. We actually collect data. We don't sit in our armchair and cogitate. And what we're trying to study is not just physical settings, not just design to build things, but we're trying to study the social setting too, where people behave and where human needs are met. Now, the reason I say the social setting is so important is because it seems to me the same physical circumstance can work or not work depending on who's there. That you may have 100 lectures in this room. Sometimes the lecturer is good and the end product is an interesting educational experience. If the lecturer bombs out, it isn't as good of an experience, but it's not because of the room, it's because of the social element of that speaker. So I think we can't ever talk about whether a design works unless we know the social system it's in. We can't just look at the design per se. Well, as we started out about 1972, what we were trying to do was to wed the work of behavioral scientists and designers. And an industrial designer in our department thought it would be useful to start studying aged because the aged need prosthetic environments that would meet them halfway and compensate for arthritis and loss of strength and vision and so on. So we started doing studies of nursing homes, and we came out with a series of 6 questions that I'd like to share with you. And I think these questions are kind of useful for post-construction studies. They're useful for programming, and they're really useful for running a facility or even running any kind of a built environment. The first question is, what are the goals to be achieved through these physical and social arrangements? Whether the physical and social arrangements have to do with education, or have to do with rehabilitation of elderly, or have to do with hospital care, you have to know what the goals are. And let me give you an example of a case in point. This is a classroom building at Miami-Dade University in Florida. It consists of 6 pie-shaped rooms. Each room can seat 300 students, and in the center is a core where you can run 6 TV sets all simultaneously. So if you say the goal of education is to impart information one way, this is a beautifully designed educational setting. So whether one thinks that's education, such as we're doing now, you can't talk and I'm rendering all great truth here, and it's a one-way exchange. I'm not even sure that's education, but we often think it is. So if we're going to build a building for education, and we define education as a one-way exchange, then this is a great building, I suppose. Well, let's look at the second question. If we know what we're trying to do in terms of goals, the second question is, what's our philosophy or theory? For example, if you want to rehab elderly people or handicapped people, you can rehab in a lot of ways. You can use drugs, you can use behavior modification, you can go through all kinds of massage treatments. So in other words, for any goal, there may be 25 different theories. So the theory you use is going to influence the setting, and it's going to influence the behavior. So let me give an example of different philosophies of education. When I was a kid, that picture up at the top is meant to represent row on row of good little kiddies sitting with their hands folded in front of themselves on their desk, and the teacher's up front, and the teacher is telling you truth, and the kids sit there quietly, and you damn well better not chit-chat across the aisle, because that's a no-no. And so there's a certain philosophy of education. In contrast, down at the bottom, you got kids lying down in school, which is almost sinful in and of itself. They're plugged into a mechanical box, and they probably even talk to each other. Well, obviously, there's 2 totally different philosophies of education, and yet maybe education as a goal might be identical for the 2 groups. So one of our troubles is when we try to create buildings or design systems to provide goal-achieving circumstances, we have to look at the philosophy behind the goal achievement, because there might be 23 ways to skin a cat. So we've got goals, we've got philosophy. The third question is, what behaviors must be carried out and by whom to get to the goal? Again, whether you're talking about education, rehab, hospital treatment, mental illness, or what have you, there are some behaviors that ought to work. I like this picture particularly. This is, again, a different format for education. The name of the game may still be to understand something. This is less of a 2-way communication. It's really a learn-by-doing philosophy. And here are the people, roughly a 30-to-1 ratio with a prof or a graduate assistant, and the people looking into their microscopes and dissecting the frog. And here's this guy down front, seeing he's really looking there, trying to find the heart. And all of a sudden, he raises his hand, he says, "Teacher, teacher, I found the heart." And the teacher comes over and looks, and they check the lab manual, and he says, "No, you're 3 centimeters off. That's the testicle." So anyhow, you pay your money and you make your choice. So we're saying that these are basic issues that you have to deal with as a designer or as a space manager running the system. What's the goal? What's the philosophy? What's the behavior? And then behind all this, there's a backup routine. If you're going to run a college, you've got to have secretaries, and you've got to have janitors, and you've got to have all kinds of people to make the show work. In the early days of automated instruction, when they first came out with language labs back in the dark ages, it looked like this was a very efficient way to teach, because you could plug in the tape, you didn't need a teacher, and the student could go at their own pace. This, of course, has been expanded now to physics and psychology and math, and almost any subject can work this way. But the grim reality is there's got to be a tremendous organization and backup staff to make this thing work. So we sometimes have to look at the learning system or any other system and see, is it all together in terms of the organization? So we've got goals, philosophy, behavior, backup support. Then the next question is, what areas or settings are the essential behaviors carried out? In other words, this is architecture. Where do you put it? This is a very beautiful picture. This is a class that I teach. And the interesting thing about this class, or maybe there's a lot of interesting things, but the very first time I taught a man-environment program or study course, they put us in a room that held 200 bodies. It's a amphitheater that's all concrete with these pipes so people won't fall over and get killed, I guess. And it's nice because you can scooch down behind the pipes and you can cut off the teacher's head. There's all sorts of fun things you can do in a class like this. The interesting thing, I use this picture quite often, and someone pointed out to me, and it was a picture taken when I was lecturing, and somebody pointed out to me, boy, you really mesmerize the kids. One of them's reading newspaper up front, the other one's talking to her neighbor, one up in back is writing a letter. That guy with the number on his chest there in the aisle, he's an architect. You know, he wouldn't even sit in a chair, he had to sit on the stairs. The fire marshal took care of him in due time. But this was really a hostile environment because it was all concrete and all these pipes, and down in front it was like a pit. You know, they should have let a lion in and I could have stripped to the waist and have at it. And there was no way to get a feeling for the students. You really didn't have any sense of warmth or human contact. The environment had really forced you into a very mechanistic exchange. So what I'm saying is that the setting can make a difference. I'm not sure this is architectural determinism, but it certainly was a handicap to teach in it. It was a very cold environment. So what we've got then are these 6 questions: the goals, the philosophy, the behavior, the support, the setting, and the final one, if we're going to reach goals, really has to do with pacing. This isn't a design issue, it's a management issue, I suppose. And the question is, if we're going to teach people something or rehabilitate people or help them get healthy or whatever we're trying to do, how long do you do it? How fast do you do it? How long do you have a session? And so one of our problems, it seems to me, is we have to take into account the pacing of goal-related behavior as well as the settings and all the other factors. So fundamentally then, these 6 questions I see as a basis for programming. They're a basis for getting the client to get his head together. If you don't know what your goals are, you sure can't build a building or even do an interior space that's going to make any sense. So these are heuristic devices. They aren't God's solution to the world's ills, but maybe they help to guide thinking that clients can do with designers. Well, if somebody is one of these environmental analyst types, what have you got going for you? What can I do, or what skills do I bring that an architect or an interior designer or a product designer may not have as fully toned or sharpened as supposedly I'd have? And it seems to me what we're talking about basically is social science research skills. And this could be shown by an anthropologist or a sociologist or a psychologist. They're the kind of things you learn in advanced courses, such as research design. How do I build a piece of research to do a post-construction study? What kind of tools do I use? Do I interview? Do I use movies? Do I do systematic observation? How do I time sample? These are things that if I've had a good social science education, I should be able to answer easily. Finally, over here at sort of 8 o'clock is data analysis skills. If I get a lot of data, numerical form or qualitative, how do I put it together and make sense out of it and give interpretations? So these are 3 tool skills that any behavioral scientist who's worth his salt or her salt can handle. Well, then there's 2 more skills that are very vital. If you look at the one at the bottom there, sort of at 6 o'clock, I call that communication skills. And what I'm talking about is, by and large, designers don't like to read. At least this has been my experience. I've had some working relationships with architects, and they don't even write letters. They'll call you on the phone and they'll talk to you, but they won't write. And so what we have to do, instead of laying a 200-page report on them and say, hey, read it, we've got to find a way to communicate visually, or at least in a succinct way that they'll buy. So I think the communication skills between the researcher and the designer is something that one has to hone quite well. Slides seem to be one way to play that game. Another skill is what I call interpersonal skills, and what I mean there is I really have to learn how to tell people they blew it without offending them, because most of the time that I do research on buildings or on any kind of design product, I'm probably going to show some things that went wrong, and most people really don't want to hear about what went wrong. So we've been spending quite a bit of time on trying to figure out how do you present a non-threatening message that sort of says, hey, you didn't do it right. And again, I think there are ways which work pretty well. Instead of what we used to do is show pictures and say, hey, dummy, look, you blew it. Now what we do is we show a lot of slides and we show good things and not so good things and let people draw their own conclusions. And usually designers are pretty astute. They can figure out a good from a bad. The last skill that seems important, and I've called it design skills, but I don't really feel it's that, It's really an understanding of the design process or the designer's norms. I suppose one of the biggest difference between a researcher, social science researcher's norms and a designer's norms is time frame. That usually if I do a piece of research, I might have 18 months, 3 years, or even a 5-year contract. And if I don't get done with my research, I write a letter to the National Science Foundation and say, hey, may I have a year extension? On the other hand, a designer usually has hours, days, or if he's lucky, weeks. And I once talked to Henry Sanoff, and he said, you know, Mr. Behavioral Scientist, I'd like to use your data, but I'm going to draw the drawings tonight with or without it. And I think that time frame, that norm that the designer has to live with is something most scientists don't really appreciate or understand. So these are the skills, it seems to me, that someone trained in the area that I'm interested in probably brings to the designer. And it's something that sort of grows with experience. Well, let's look at another issue. Let's sort of demystify science. It seems to me all we're doing when we talk about scientific research, we're doing orderly research, you're doing systematic research, but it's really fact-finding. When you go to the store and you say, do I want the 10-ounce can or do I want the 12-ounce can or the 15-ounce can, that's research. You're fact-finding and you're going to make decisions on it. So I don't think there's anything magic about scientific research. I suppose what it is, it's a little more precise and it's a little more orderly and it's a little more public, but it isn't something that anyone can't comprehend if they want to work at practicing with it. So in a lot of respects, the design process is not unlike the scientific problem-solving process. We both start out with observations. If I want to make an inference or draw some conclusions about will this building be more comfortable than that, or will this room work better than that, I start out with observations. Well, designers start out with observations. Then I draw some conclusions, or I come up with a generalization. But as a social scientist, I'll usually call that generalization a hypothesis, and then I'll proceed to collect some more data reflected in these little boxes, S1, S2, S3, which means sample 1, sample 2, sample 3. So what I usually would do if I did one study, I'm not sure I can trust it because maybe I blew it or I had an unrepresentative sample, but if I replicated my studies, if I did 3 studies and they all came out the same way, then I'd be more willing to trust it. But one of the difficulties in the man-environment area, we don't have many replications. We've got individual studies which get written up, but we don't repeat them, so we may not really be dealing with hard data. The designer usually doesn't replicate his solutions in this sense either. The headache for the scientist is the data reliable? Can I trust it? If I were to measure my waist with a rubber measuring device, I could have an 18-inch waist. If I let it be real, I could have a 36-inch waist. And so which is the real me? If you've seen me come in, you know which is the real me. But anyhow, the issue then of reliability is, do my tests or do my measurements measure what they're supposed to? So if we don't have reliable data, we really can't make intelligent decisions. So the scientist is very hung up on reliability, which is probably wise. What we try to do when we collect data, we, again, have done some nursing home studies. We've recently done a study of the only quadriplegic housing in the United States for HUD. We've done a study for the Army Corps of Engineers. These were all post-construction studies. And what we try to do is use a lot of tools so they cover each other, so you get redundancy. For example, with aged, one of the problems is they often tell you what they think you want to hear. So you might say, hey, Charlie, do you use the sunroom? And Charlie thinks he's supposed to, so he says, oh, yeah, of course I use the sunroom. So what we used to do is we'd ask the staff, does Charlie use the sunroom? We'd ask Charlie, do you use the sunroom? Then we'd take pictures, and if Charlie's in the sunroom, that's a score. Then we'd systematically observe, and there's Charlie in the sunroom, and maybe we walk around and do some casual observation. Well, if lo and behold, Charlie's in the sunroom all the times that we do these things, it's pretty safe to say, yeah, Charlie uses the sunroom. On the other hand, if all we did was interview him, he might really be pulling our leg. So one of the problems is, if our tools aren't too hot, we have to use more than one tool and hope that we can crisscross and maybe get confirmation of our findings by that means. This is sort of inefficient, but you also pick up a lot of other interesting information in the course of it. One of the things we've done with our backward slide there, it's Russian, we've used systematic observation to try and look at traffic patterns and try to look at where do people do what. And one of the things we find in nursing homes, for example, is people congregate around windows. This happens to be a corridor, and that L-shaped thing inverted over to the left is a nursing station. And so people like to gather around the nursing station because that's where the action is. People come to get pills, people come to do this, that, and the other thing. And so what happens is, action is relative. So what we did with these systematic observations, which usually were done for 20-minute periods, we were trying to say, hey, where do people place themselves in space and how long do they stay? Now, obviously, when you try to show 20 minutes in one picture, you really blow it like we did, and the tracks get very intense and it doesn't work very well. But I think this concept could be used with a videotape or could be used in a movie, and you could have some very interesting information that could be sort of animated use of space over time. And you can draw some pretty interesting inferences. The fire marshal would have a hemorrhage if he saw this, where the corridors crowded up like that. The star there in the chair, that's where I sat, the observer. What we're doing currently is asking a basic question: what is the relationship, or where does research fit in? And this design process model is a creation of John Zeisel up at Harvard. And John's argument is that the design process is, of course, cyclical. It keeps going and spinning and growing on itself. And you start out in the middle there with pre-design. He's talking about an architectural scale. You start out with the pre-design programming, then you go to design through schematics and design development into working drawings, then you construct the building, and then it's put into use, and then you do what he says up there in that blur at about 11 o'clock, a post-diagnostic evaluation. And what he means is, given what you were trying to do, how does it work? And when you do that, you can learn a lot of things. You can learn how do people use the space. You can learn what kind of activities really take place in terms of intended uses versus unintended. You can maybe even learn some basic information about behavior that might be useful in general. And you can learn quite a bit about that kind of building type or that kind of space type that could be plugged into the next program. So the contention is this isn't an evaluation in the sense, oh, you blew it, but rather this is an evaluation in the sense of what did we learn from experience. So presumably this shouldn't be a threatening thing for a designer. It ought to be a way to learn from everything he does. And many writers, such as Mike Brill and Ray Studer, have been arguing for several years, every building is an experiment, but we never collect the data to learn the outcome. So this model is saying, hey, let's collect data and learn the outcome. One of the studies we did was on pre-programming. In other words, before the designer started working, we went in and we talked to the residents of this nursing home, or veterans home, which is in Oxford, New York. It was a 242-bed facility. At the time, there were 170 people lived there. And they were going to build a new building. In fact, it's about to go under construction. And so we were given a $20,000 contract to try and learn something about the users. And we thought, based on our earlier work with elderly, if we could do what we called a user profile, that might be helpful to the designers. And a user profile is a collection of information about design-relevant characteristics of people who use space. So in the case of the elderly, for example, we found in some of our studies that 50% of the population used wheelchairs. So when you made a lounge, they all brought their chair with them, so you didn't need a lot of furniture because they had theirs. On the other hand, if you're going to bring a wheelchair into the dining hall and you're going to transfer, you got to have a parking space for the wheelchair. Or if people use walkers, which are those little aluminum things that go about waist high, when you use a walker and you go into a dining hall or into a lounge, you got to park your walker. And so if we could tell what kind of mobility aids people had in this facility, we could offer the designers some suggestion about space and about parking spaces. Also, if you know that 30% of the people have arthritis, elderly people or anybody with arthritis often can't do things that require closure of the hand and pinch functions with, that's not said very well. Old people who have arthritis can pinch. But what I'm trying to say is that if you want to put your thumb against your forefinger and you've got arthritis, it's often a painful event. And even a normal front door key, the thin kind, those are very hard for some arthritic people to use. Many shower controls and faucet controls are very hard for arthritics to use. There's a new faucet out on the market now that has a lever arm, very much like a medical faucet control, because arthritics can use it with their elbow or the back of their hand. They don't have to make these pinching movements. So if you know something about how many people have arthritis, that may tell you something about what you ought to do in your design decision making on hardware. Also, if you know something about sensory acuity, maybe you know a lot of people who are elderly, because they have yellowing lenses that comes about through age, they really can't make red or blue-green discriminations at all well. So if you color code, don't color code in blue-green in an elderly place because they're looking through a yellow filter and it doesn't discriminate. So the more we could tell the designer about the user's characteristics that might have an impact on design, the more likely we could save the designer time in making design decisions. And that was the logic behind it. We interviewed people, we We lived in the facility, and we really got the book on them. In fact, we wrote a 205-page book on everything you want to know about elderly and a few things you probably don't care about. And then we got into programming, and the issue in programming is how will this space be used? What functions will go on here? And our thought was if we could really give them a user profile and some program information, what do people do in lounges, what do people do in pool rooms, what do people do in libraries, then when we wanted to do a post-construction study, we'd have that program that told us what we were supposed to do. So the program is sort of the map, and the post-construction is how well does the map work. And this becomes, again, this cyclical process, and you get feedback, and you can learn something. So in our facility, we spent a lot of time with the ladies and had a little fun with the girls. And we found such horrible things as many tables really don't fit wheelchairs very well. And so if you have an elderly person who sits in a wheelchair and they go to dinner to eat and the wheelchair won't let them get under the table, they have to take the food from their plate all the way across their lap over to their mouth. If they've got any kind of shakes, all of a sudden the food runs into their lap. They feel embarrassed and they don't want to eat there tomorrow. They want to eat in their room. So suddenly you've been doing something with their self-concept just because you had a bad mismatch between the table and the wheelchair. So there are a lot of psychological ramifications of design that isn't sensitive to the user. Well, we spent a lot of time, and as I say, we did our 205-page book, which I think the designers never read, and presumably the research was the basis for a program. I'm not saying designers can't read, I say they won't read. The other thing that was kind of tricky in this situation, which will happen if you get into very complex organizations, is there were an awful lot of people in the act. There were at least 3 clients. The State Dormitory Authority, that box over to the upper left, they provided the money. The Department of Health, they owned the building, and so they were a client. Oxford Management was going to live in the new building, and so they were a client. And we were the expert researchers, so we sort of had an input. And then TAC, the Architects Collaborative, were the designers. And we had a devil of a time deciding who's in charge here. And a lot of times we had endless meetings to try and make decisions because it wasn't clear who the client was. There should have been a committee formed that sort of could break the ties and decide the trade-offs. So this was a very inefficient effort, and a lot of agony and money was spent because we didn't have a game plan that fitted together very well. Also, we spent a lot of time, as the designers did the drawings, we'd go back, and this was the manager and one of the researchers and myself, and we spent an awful lot of time asking him why it will work, why it won't work. And so we were getting a lot of information we could pump back to the designers, and they didn't necessarily have to make the trip from Boston down to Oxford, which is about 300 miles. The other thing that got kind of interesting, when we were in this research thing, and again, we literally lived there, the winter of '73, I was home for Christmas, but I spent most of the time at the old folks site, and I used to get up in the morning, elbow people out of the way to get to the shower first, and really got the feel of the thing. And one of the things that happened was this staff here was really super, and tender loving care was sort of the name of the game. And we found as we started to do research and make suggestions about those 6 questions we talked of before, that suddenly the staff started to have bright ideas, and there was sort of a Hawthorne effect. Everybody started getting into the act and coming up with creative solutions, some of which weren't design solutions but had to do with the organization. So once you start playing around with research in a setting, you very often can get people who live there all the time to get in the act too, and they may know much more about what's good and what's bad than you might as a person coming in for a temporary period. An interesting kind of thing that we kept coming up with when you interviewed people, who owns the window in a normal hospital room or a room in a nursing home? Obviously the person whose bed is next to the window. So the lady over in the back there, she owns the window. The other poor girl owns the closet. And we also found all these kind of horrible distorting lighting situations and slick floors that distorted things. Mayor Spivak up at MIT has done a lot of research on the problems of the mentally ill because of reflectance on floors, that it cuts people's heads off and it makes all sorts of perceptual distortions. So suddenly you're trying to make crazy people well, and you put them in a building that helps to make them more crazy. We ran into a lot of things. Here would be a pretty good example of a number of things. Again, think of the person who has arthritis, and in order to pinch, it hurts. So if you're going to pinch the cigarettes out of the machine there by pulling the levers, maybe you can't pull the levers. If you're going to put your fingers in the phone and dial the phone, maybe you can't do that because it hurts. And so all of a sudden, here's a very poor set of design solutions, granted, which came from the Candy Company or good old Ma Bell. But in any case, here's some design solutions that really are ill-fitted to those particular people who have certain kind of physical or physiological complaints. We ran into some kind of fun things, too. or sort of tricky, interesting psychological type things, we asked people about different features. An example was the porches. Do you want to have porches on the new building? And a lot of people said that if they did have them, they'd certainly use them. And one of the things we found in the course of interviews is that some people who had cardiac problems, they were willing to go out on the porch because that's sort of the building. But if they went way down to the ground, they might not be able to get help if they had an attack. So at one point, the designers were going to get rid of the porches as a cost-saving endeavor, and we were able to convince them between that data that told about the use of the porches and this problem of the cardiac cases perception, we were able to convince them that they ought to keep the porches on. So there are some things like that that a designer might not pick up in the normal course of events that we were able to get because we lived on the site so long. We also got feedback from the users. We used to bring the prints back and would show them to what was a resident council, and so they too could get in the act and make their observations. And so really our role became sort of advocacy planners. We were sort of the mouthpiece between the designers and the bureaucracy and the people who were going to live there in the long run. The sad story about this kind of shaggy dog story is at the time that this building was to be built, which was about late 1974, New York State suffered its financial crunch, and they put the drawings on the shelf. And just about 2 weeks ago, I was on the PA awards jury, and Sally Harkness from TAC was there, and she said they're about to do the building. And the very exciting thing, I talked to the manager about a week ago, and he said the original budget, the original cost figures for the building in mid-1974 was $7.9 million, and they got the bids back for 6.1. And apparently people are willing to work for less money these days because there isn't so much work to go around. So presumably the building is going under construction very shortly, and ideally we could do an evaluation study after they get it all together. Let's look at a different kind of thing. This was a post-construction study for a rental development that was owned by Corning Glass in Corning, New York, and it was drawn or done by Lou Sauer, who's a Philadelphia architect of reasonable renown. This is an award-winning building or development. It's a man-made lake. They had a leak in the lake, there was a lot of trouble for a while to keep the lake from leaking. There was this poor guy who sat there for years at a time with his thumb in the lake. But anyhow, for a while, Lou Sauer said, he thought this was a really nice building. It was home-like, it had this nice wooden texture and all those good things. And he said they called it Fort Apache. But it won an award anyhow. And so what we did is we came in after about the building had been up for 4 years, and we said to Lou, hey, what can we learn from this that might be useful to you? And he said, well, this is rental property, but I really want to give it a feeling of being personally owned property, and so I'd like to know how the people think I did in making the building as it was. And so we had a number of gimmicks, and he came up to Cornell, and we talked to him, and he explained his rationale for doing things, and we tape recorded it and took pictures, and he kind of gave us the book on, in effect, he told us the program. And then we went out to the site, and we talked to the management, and we wanted to do interviews because that would have given us the best dialogue and the most information. But what happened was they said, well, this is a very select area, and we don't pester our people, and we don't let salesmen come in, so we really can't let you talk to the people. You'll have to do it some other way. So we had to do questionnaires, and we got 69% return, which was roughly 65 cases back out of 108 dwelling units. And I was never impressed. This is the back of the building, and you can see up there in the middle there's a balcony, and some of the balconies were 6 by 13, and they really didn't work. You couldn't get out there and do much with them. His logic was the people downstairs get a patio, the people upstairs get a balcony. But if you get a weeny-teeny balcony, you can't do anything with it, so it doesn't give you much personal territory, and it doesn't work very well. Well, Lou was very intrigued with this particular view of the building because he said that's the back of the building. The other side faced out onto the man-made lake and had patios and big windows and all those good things. But this was the part he could fool around with because it was the back and the people didn't really care. And I said it looked like a place where they ought to jack up some cars on blocks of concrete, and be fixing them. Somehow or other, this just never grabbed me as an aesthetic experience, but the people seemed to like it, and anyhow, it was sort of the only game in town. There were very good these were probably about the best apartments in town in terms of the price and all. He did a lot of nice little things. He really made the building appear in what architects usually call human scale. And I never really understood human scale until I went to this site. And somehow or other, when you walked through it, you really didn't feel overpowered. You really felt this was a nice building that you could get into. The other thing he was really hung up on was giving everybody their own entrance, whether they were downstairs or upstairs. And he didn't want to have corridors where everybody walked in a common door and went off to their particular apartment. And so every single place, up or down, had its own private entrance. And he felt this was part of the act. Another thing, he kind of blew it on this one. This was, everybody's entitled to blowing a little. That white strip there in front of the car, that part of the building is the bedroom. And Lou felt, well, we shouldn't have a window in the bedroom, but we shouldn't have so much window, you know, people stop traffic. So what we'll have is a shotgun window. And so he built this beautiful shotgun window, and there's no curtain in America that will fit the shotgun window. And so what happened was some people put cooking foil in them, some people painted them, some people put box of crates in them, and he really blew it. It just didn't function. And what he was trying to do was somehow let light into the bedroom, and yet the window often faced out onto the street. And so there was a compromise that lost, but again, everybody's entitled to one. The next thing we did with him, which was even more exciting, because it became very clear as we talked to the people over at Corning, that what's going on here is it isn't just the designer making up the program and coming to those decisions, but there's all kinds of people. There's the developer, and there's the code people, and there's the banks, and a whole lot of people. So he was working on a 236 project down in Baltimore, and so he brought up his working drawings. The buildings weren't being built yet, but everything was ready. And we spent 4.5 hours where he went through and he explained all the decisions that he was making on the basis of the building design. So what we have now is a very lengthy document of pretty much the reasons why he made this trade-off or that trade-off, and the plan is once the building is up to do an evaluation and see how well he scored. Well, let's run a quick job through an interior design problem. I was out at a meeting in Illinois back about 1974, and a contract interior designer came up to me, and this happened to be her. And the comment she made to me was, what would it cost to have your body? I was on the program at the time, and I was supposed to be an expert on evaluation. And so if somebody like this came up to you and said, what would it cost to have your body? Obviously you have to be keen and alert and say, what does she really mean? And so I said, which part? And anyhow, to make a long story short and to keep it clean, what she was asking was if I were to consult with her, what it would cost her. And so I said, well, you know, for you, $25 an hour. And so what we did was I said, when are you going to the site? She said, I have a hospital job. I have to do an interior design on this hospital out in California. And I'd like to have you help me so we could evaluate the building and do a good program and design it and then go back and look at it and see how good we are. And so I said, that's very nice. When are you going to the site? And she said, tomorrow morning. So I sat down, I wrote her a memo, and I said, when you go out there, what you want to do is this. You want to look at this, you want to take pictures of that, you want to interview these people. And so she got an instant course in man-environment relations. And so she went out to the site. It was very charming. This is the old building, not the new one. This is the old building, vintage 1945 maybe. The new one is a little better, but the new one came from canned plans out of Washington that were shipped to California. The architects didn't go to the site, and they unrolled the plans, and some construction outfit put it together. And so then she inherited that shell and was told, make it pretty. And it was very pretty before, in its own way. You'll note this little trickery here. See, the crummy pictures are before, and the color pictures are after, you know, that old designer trick. And so one of the things we did was we looked at the people and what they did, as I had suggested to her. And she found a number of interesting things. One was, as here, the people usually came in twos. Somebody drove and somebody else who was sick came. And often it was a mama with some kids. And sometimes the mom had little kids, and the little kids were young enough that she had a diaper bag. And so we started saying, well, look, why don't we get some chairs that would seat two, and why don't we get big arms on the chairs so that we can put the diaper bags there? And we thought, ho, 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 we are so terribly clever. We ought to win a prize. Well, what has happened since then is these big arms are so great that kids run on them. And the other thing that happened we were so terribly clever about was elderly people often were sitting in this area and the kids bugged them. So we said, well, let's make a kids area and let's get some big pieces of sponge and we'll stick them over to the side and keep the kids away from the rest of the people. And so very cleverly we put them over to the extreme left of the picture, which happens to be where the reception desk is. So now after you fight your way through the rubber and over the kids, you can get to the reception desk and you can't hear yourself think while the kids run up and down and jump. And so we had a little problem there. The other thing we did, which was extremely clever, there were three kinds of doctors there. There were ordinary general general practitioners to take care of people whose noses ran and who coughed and did all those awful things. And then there were people who had eye problems, an oculist, and then there was a dentist. And very cleverly, again, you know, I had a PhD in psychology, we said, gee, if I'm going to the doctor to get my eyes examined, why should I sit next to somebody and have them cough germs on me? And so what we did was we aimed the seats towards the doctor's office. So those people who have eyeball problems, they sit there and have eyeball problems together. And those people who have germs, they sit there and share germs. And the people who go to the dentist, they sit there and smile at each other like Jimmy Carter. And so that part seemed to work. So we were very pleased with that. This was, again, a typical area over in the corner. It was really dum-dum, very, very drab. And one of the things that we, and this isn't much less drab, but it's in color. One of the things that bothered me in making some of these design decisions, we decided, well, there's three major entries to the building. One was an outpatient clinic, another was kind of a visitor's door, and the third was emergency. And so being very keen and alert, we said, what color do you make those doors? So we said blue, brown, and red. And of course the red is the emergency part, obviously. Blue and brown was a toss of the coin. And so then she said, well, what color shall we do the walls in the emergency waiting room? And I said, I don't know, something calm. And she said, how about red? And so I said, no, not red. Red is evil. You know, red makes you excited and all those bad things. And anyhow, she'd settled for red, and this is sort of a brick red. And apparently people haven't climbed the walls, but that was one where I didn't have any data on me. She had an opinion, and so we let it go and said, well, we'll see what happens to the people. And so we go and we count the finger marks as they climb the wall, and we'll be able to tell whether the red walls were good or bad. Actually, when we did the post-construction study, we did a questionnaire, which I didn't build. Someone in her staff did, and we did it after 3 months and again after 9 months, and it was on a 1 to 7 rating usually, which isn't necessarily a super tool, but that was what we used. And the ratings were very high. The people were really quite content with the situation. But it may have been it was such a quantum leap from the crummy place they'd been before. And what would be ideal, of course, is to literally go out there and walk through the place and talk to people. Perhaps the big punchline in that study was that we had the same time frame. I think it was 13 weeks, the way she usually designs and the way she designed with me in the act. And what happened was she allocated her time differently, and she felt pretty good because she could search the catalogs, and she could throw away certain things that weren't necessary to search. If we were going to get armchairs of a certain order, she knew certain companies didn't make those, so there was no point in even looking at those catalogs. And her feeling was it didn't take her any more time. It only cost her $125 for 5 hours of my presence. And actually, she felt much firmer about her design decisions than otherwise. And apparently, the clients continue to be happy a year and a half later. So we were fairly happy with that effort, and it wasn't high science. It was just a meager effort. This last one is a quadriplegic housing unit out in Columbus, Ohio. And HUD insured this. It's the only quadriplegic housing in the United States, at least insured by HUD. There's two others in existence, one at BC and one in Houston. And the idea here was to provide a place where quadriplegics, who are people paralyzed to some degree from the neck down, the degree of paralysis is a function of where their back was broken or their spine was severed. These guys are both C5s, which means that they have deltoid control and bicep control, but they can't use their fingers. And those things on their hands are sort of wrist stiffeners, which allow them to pick up cups and do a number of things. Their wheelchairs are motorized, and there's a power pack, sort of a big battery, sort of like in a car, on the back, and those will run them anywhere around the campus, and they can control that by a little piece over by their arm. Another thing that people are able to do who are quadriplegic is work with mouth sticks. And a mouth stick is merely a light device that has a bite plate on it, and people can typewrite with them, they can dial telephones, they can switch light switches off and on, play stereos, very fantastic as to their capability. As you can see, there's this mouthpiece that you bite down on, and it clamps into your mouth. There was one young fellow out there who was about 22. He came from Columbus. He had been out in his yard one night. He was picking up worms when he was in 10th grade. A neighbor saw some commotion in the bushes, shot, hit the kid in the neck, and totally paralyzed him. And he has a mouth stick that's a little fancier than that. It's got a power pack on it, and in the middle, the Y part of that plasticky thing, there are two buttons, and you push one button with your tongue, and this stick will extend 43 inches. You push the other, and it'll retract. And so he paints with this mouth stick. And last year he submitted a painting to the Ohio State Fair, and his was one of 4 out of 500 chosen. And the amazing thing is none of these people were bitching. I was there for 4 days, and I never saw anybody that were so capable of coping with the world as these people. Most of them are either going to school or working in town. They have to be employed or what have you. One of the horrors of this design, the design was done by a man whose son was quadriplegic. And theoretically, you'd think, well, gee, if you know the user, you can do it right. And the kind of problems they ran into it was just almost a comedy of errors. For example, that tank in the middle of the sink there is a garbage disposal, and of course that would have been a very good idea, because if these people, what happens is somebody comes in and helps them get up in the morning, shaves them, dresses them, and puts them in the motorized wheelchair, and this takes about an hour. Then they're on their own all day, and then at the end of the day, the same personal assistant comes in and helps get them into bed. Then there are 18 units to this apartment house, and there's sort of a command module that's in contact with all 18 apartments, and that person or that group of people are there all day or all night around the clock. So what you have is 18 people being helped 2 hours a day plus one person around the clock, whereas normally a quadriplegic would have to have somebody with them 24 hours a day. They can't cough because their chest muscles don't work. They can't eliminate because their muscles there don't work. And so they have to be helped in almost all the practical things that most of us take for granted. But the horror of this disposal is it's so located that even if there wasn't so much trash under the sink, you can't get in there with a wheelchair and still get at the water. The other thing was the bar refrigerator is so low that if you can get it open, which has its own problems, there isn't any handle, it's one of those vacuum jobs, you can't get down into the drawers. The stove itself is one where you have to put your hand on the controls, squeeze them. These people by and large don't have any finger control. And the assumption had been, well, they won't be using this equipment anyhow because somebody else will do it. But the fact is some of them could have used it in a crude way if the design had been appropriate or the choices had been appropriate. Another thing they ran into is if you've got only limited strength in your arm, to have to reach far and do something is very difficult. So the height of the light switches were okay, but the depth into the wall was bad. Also, the mismatch between the desktop and the wheelchair lapboard was such that they could never get under their desk. You'll also find any flat space is loaded with stuff because most of them have to put things at arm level or waist level so they can get at them. So everything looked very cluttered and somewhat messy. What I'd like to do is end up with a few thoughts on collaboration between the disciplines. These drawings were done by an architect, so they usually needled a behavioral scientist. He was one of my students. He's still in school. He's never going to graduate. Anyhow, one of the problems is you really can't go to your local college and take a social scientist off the rack because most of them aren't into the design thing and they may or may not be able to be very helpful. So the designer has to be somewhat discriminating. Also, there's all kinds of psychologists and all kinds of sociologists and anthropologists. There are social psychologists and child psychologists and physiological psychologists. So there's a lot of different brands, and some of them wouldn't have the vaguest clue about anything relating to buildings. Others might be very useful in their knowledge of elderly or young people or what have you. Another big problem, as I mentioned, is this time frame bit, that by and large the researcher's working in months and years and the designer's working in hours and weeks, and so they frustrate each other. The designer can't understand why the guy's so darn slow, and the researcher can't understand why you expect me to be so fast. Another problem is what might be called quick and dirty research. There's the assumption if I do research in a hurry, it can't possibly be any good. This summer we did a project for both HUD, paraplegic, quadriplegic one, and for the Army, and we did both of them simultaneously in 6 weeks. And based on the research findings, the Army is changing its specifications for barracks, and HUD is going to produce 2,000 copies of a report we did as guidelines to designing for quads. So I think it is possible to do fast research if you do it carefully and don't overextend the information you've got. The other hang-up that really bugs the designer is this fence-sitting phenomenon, that if you say, hey, how should I do this? They say, well, gee, I don't have enough data, it'll take more research. And so you've got to make the decision on the board while they're sitting on the fence. So this is one of the major frustrations. The scientist is trained to be cautious and careful. Designers are trained to leap into the unknown and solve problems. Another thing that bothers us very often is this damn intuition. Intuition is a big bunch of stuff. What it really is overlearning, and you forgot that you did it by trial and error back then. So I think intuition is probably really a fiction. But designers are very attached to that idea, and scientists do intuition too with respect to their work. A real hang-up is the question of who's in charge here. When we worked with TAC on the project in the elderly project, it was very annoying because they were always up front and they were the one who called the shots. And that was a little hard to take because we felt some of our data should dictate some solutions, but we were usually overruled. If you really want to bug a designer, you whip out a felt tip and a little brown paper and you start doing a little drawing. I always carry a felt tip now as a threat, and sometimes I even carry brown paper. And you never know when brown paper will come in handy. So there's a real question of division of labor, and when you start encroaching on the other profession's territory, they get very ticked off. And one of the people that worked with me used to do this repeatedly, and she really got the designers very incensed that she was trying to design and she had no right to. This one I'm not sure is really true, but it made such a nice cartoon that the guy put it in. And that is that the architect is legally liable. If his building falls down, he's in deep trouble. If I tell him how to build a building and it falls down, sorry about that. You know, I don't have any insurance. So I whistle away, and he's stuck with his building that's falling apart. The real thing that most of the architects that I've worked with have said is, you saved us a lot of false starts. You were able to help us see certain things, or you had information about the client or about the user that enabled us to not have to do some of the things that we normally do. And instead of making 16 drawings, you might be able to tell us, do it this way or do it that way. This was very true in the Oxford study, where the architects could call us and we could either have the data or we could get it very quickly. Well, the parting shot here is, it was very tense sometimes working with them. We were under the gun and things got rather heavy. And about a year after we finished the project, the team captain, the architect, and I were invited to make a presentation at the national meeting of the AIA down in Atlanta. And it was sort of like a divorced couple getting back together. You know, we were really great and we had a lovely time together because we weren't under the gun anymore and we weren't attached. And so maybe there's a lesson to be learned in that. Let me stop here, and I'd be glad to answer questions for anybody who wants to ask any. I think one thing I didn't talk about that I would guess is very vital, at least to practicing architects, is how much do you cost and why should I bother? And currently, in most of the studies we've been doing, we're taking the stance, or trying to take the stance, that if I can't prove to you I'll save you more money than I cost, then you shouldn't bother with me. So I think this pragmatic stance is really essential if you're going to work in a normal situation, that a designer or a architect isn't about to spend $5,000 and wait 18 months for some research findings. He might be willing, as the Army was, to wait to pay $10,000, get the answers in 3 weeks, and be able to save maybe 10 times that in the design decisions. So I think that one of the problems with an academic researcher is you don't have the kind of flexibility that you can do things fast. And the only reason I was able to in these projects was it was summer, and also I was on sabbatic, so we were able to work night and day. I think the other thing is, any of the things I've said about architecture, probably those principles would hold at other scales of design, the idea about the user profile and those things. Yes? Okay, the question was, did we use user participation in the second and third project, which I think was probably the hospital and Lou Sauer's project. In the case of the hospital, we definitely did. We interviewed the staff people and, well, everybody, the nurses and everything, because it was a small hospital and had about a staff of 26. And so they also got a chance to look at the review when the design went back for final approval. In the case of Lou Sauer's study, it was a thesis study that a student of mine was doing, and the participation really involved that the building was built, the program was done, and all that. What we were doing was trying to find out how well did Lou predict whether the things that he thought were important were in fact important. So what the people told us was, these design features work, they're good, these don't. And so we were really checking out his accuracy of prediction. In the case of the quadriplegics, we interviewed each of the 18 for at least an hour, and we spent 4 days on the site. And they were very much involved in it because the idea in that study is, presumably what we found out about how that building was put together and how those things work are going to become at least useful hints, so that if another citizens group wants to get into a building for the handicapped or severely disabled, they at least won't make the same mistake. They may find 32 new ones, but they'll make a different set. So in all the cases except Sauer's, there was an attempt to to get participation. And I usually feel when we're in the programming end up front that we're really advocacy planners. We're trying to say, hey, tell us what you want to know so we can tell somebody. And in the case of the quadriplegic, we were saying, hey, if you want better buildings like this to be built, tell us, we'll go tell HUD, and something will happen. Now, we can't always guarantee that's true. You know, HUD can say, we care, tell us, we'll do something, and maybe they will, maybe they won't. But I think if you're going to get rapport with the users and really have them take the time to do these things, you sort of have to honestly promise them something. Why should they bother to take their time? I think you may have had another part that I didn't hear at the end. Okay. Well, maybe we can split. If anybody does want to ask anything else, I'd be glad to talk with individuals. Or if anybody has a question.